This is a compositional exercise intended to take a lot of the ideas that we've discussed and looked at in other previous videos and see that you can sort of use this idea of composition as a means of exploration. I've obviously sped this video up quite a bit in certain parts. This here is what I'm basically taking is that I cut out a 6 by 4 inch piece of paper. That way I could trace it onto other surfaces and sort of reuse that same scale. That way I don't have to measure things out. I'm now taking other pieces of paper and cutting up different shapes. And I'd like you to do this for at least one of your compositions. This is very handy in creating a symmetrical composition. I'm sort of taking this time to even experiment and explore. So right now I'm sort of just drawing on a piece of paper. Once it was dry, I then took an X-Acto knife and this is at real speed, very much so, taking my time, so I'm not cutting myself or anything. But the goal was here is to create a different shape than I would create if I didn't, say, draw on the paper first. So this creates a much more organic shape. And this approach is different than the other approaches as far as just cutting squares and rectangles and basic geometric shapes. And so what that does is that because I changed my approach, that the resulting shape is also going to be changed. And so you see artists do this all the time. They'll change the approach, that way their work doesn't seem to get stagnated, it doesn't get stagnant, and you can sort of create more variety just by changing your starting point. I'm now just coloring these, filling in with a marker. This is just solely so that they're easier to see when I lay them out on the composition for the video. And so now that I have all these pieces created, this is creating a starting point for a composition. So what I want you to do is, just for one, do this, but this is much easier when coming up with a symmetrical design. And so one of the parameters that I want you to do is to create an actual symmetrical design. So I created a vertical axis here, so I can create a symmetrical from one side to the other. And because I have these pieces cut out, it's very easy for me to sort of loosely place them on the composition. And make sure that they're even on both sides, because I can flip the actual piece itself. This would be much more difficult composition to come up with if I didn't have these pieces already cut out. And so I'm not following any specific rules. Once I get to a certain point here, you can see I start freehanding some elements to it. I even take a ruler at different points. And what I want you to do for all three of your compositions is that I just labeled that symmetrical. And what I want you to do is, after you create one composition utilizing symmetry, I want you to create another composition using asymmetry, which is the one I'm working on right here. You don't have to use shapes and outlining them for this one if you don't want to. I did, mainly because I already had them, and it's actually a pretty useful tool for duplicating things, which is much harder to do just by freehanding things. So that organic shape that I have, that would be almost impossible to duplicate that on one side or the other. So here I'm very clearly labeling it asymmetrical, or if you just want to label it asymmetry, anything that shows the sort of variation. And so the third one that I'm working on is approximate symmetry. And so I'm very loosely just drawing a vertical axis down, and I'm sort of working with this similar elements of, it's roughly the same on both sides, but I'm sort of exploring different ideas, and it's much more loose and organic. And it almost sort of looks like a landscape, and I started playing with that idea, making a little river in the foreground. And I named it approximate symmetry. Spelling is not fantastic here, that's okay. But you can see that that's loosely asymmetrical, and that was a vertical composition too. So if you want to work horizontal, vertical, or both of them, that's fine. But once you have one that you think is your strongest composition, what I want you to do is to develop it further. And so what does that mean? I'm not putting limitations on materials that you're using, but this is an occasion for you to explore different materials. So here I'm just using markers in a very basic fashion, speeding it up quite a bit. And I'm sort of playing around with this idea of coloring it in symmetrically. I'm using different colors. I'm sort of balancing those colors throughout the composition as a way of unifying the image. But I also, once I have the markers down here, I decided to see what would happen if I develop it further with India ink on top of marker, because marker is a very basic material, and I think it gets very boring. But I think when we combine it with other things, it can be very useful of applying some basic color. So what I did here is I took India ink and sort of watered it down a little bit. And so what happens is it starts to create a shade of the colors that are already there. I decided here to just erase all of those guidelines. I didn't want them showing up in my final image. And I started to build some of these ink washes that on top of the materials there, and I'm working very organically. I don't have anything really planned out. I just thought this looked like a interesting sort of geometric image. It almost sort of looks like power lines over a landscape, or I think a lot of that has to do with the color. And once I applied some value here, I decided I think this needed something more. So I decided to go back in with just a pen that was just my writing pen that I use. And because it has very thin lines, I decided to build up the value more through the image. And so I'm going back in here, I'm drawing some cross-hatching lines, introducing this element of line also as an attempt to sort of unify the image, bringing it together. And I think that's just about done there, and that's all I've taken. So this is developed a lot further than what it was when it was just a line drawing. And I think, it allowed me to explore this idea of composition a little bit more. And I wrote down there calmness, order, and structure, because those are three things that I think a lot of symmetrical designs try and do. And so I think calmness wasn't a part of that, though. So read this carefully. The point structure might be slightly changed. Check the specs on that. But what I would like to see you do is to create 3 compositions, label them at least 4 by 6 inches or larger, and then develop that one further. However that is developed is going to be up to you, depending on materials and whatever experiments you want to conduct. So it's pretty basic. Once you have all of those, make sure you document them and upload them onto online.